Get started. My name's Dave Bugney, and I'm the incoming board chair of the Clackamas River Basin Council. And I want to thank you tonight for joining us for our 32nd, and as I mentioned, our last session of the journey down the Clackamas. So joining me tonight is Todd Bartlett, who's the current Clackamas River Basin Council board chair, and he'll assist me in all the technical aspects of the program. So before we get into our program, I'd like to cover a few items. Since its founding 26 years ago, the CRBC has worked as a non-governmental group of stakeholders to protect and improve the Clackamas River Basin and its tributaries. Their mission is to foster partnerships for clean water and to improve fish and wildlife habitat and the quality of life for all those who live, work, and recreate within the Clackamas River Basin. On behalf of the Basin Council, I'd like to thank our two gold sponsors, Oregon Beverage Recycling Cooperative and the Clackamas Water Environment Services. We also like to thank our bronze sponsors, the Clackamas River Water Providers, the Geological Society of the Oregon Country, Port Blakely, and Metro. So thanks also to all the individuals who helped donate to support our conference over this past about 15 months or so. It's hard to amaze. It's amazing to me. We've had 15 months of this. It's just blown by. The Clackamas River Basin has been occupied by Native peoples for millennia. It's originally the territory of the Clackamas, Chinook, Molalla, Kalapuya, and other peoples. It is currently recognized as lands of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, and belongs to other Native peoples who may not be federally recognized. We thank those who came before us for their stewardship of these lands and waters, and for those who continue to steward them now and in the future. So we're gathered for this journey down the Clackamas to learn in-depth information about the basin and its connections to Oregon as a whole, to connect with each other so that we can support our mutual efforts to protect and improve the Clackamas River and its tributaries, and to have some educational fun. So the CRBC is partnering with the Environmental Learning Center at Clackamas Community College. Workshop attendees will receive science certificate of completion for each session. If you'd like a certificate of completion, please add your contact information to our Journey Down the Clackamas Conferencing Networking Google Sheet and indicate you'd like a certificate in the G column, and we'll forward your contact information to Clackamas Community College. So I'd like to share a few ground rules before I introduce our special guest for tonight. So please keep your microphones on mute unless invited to participate, and you can keep your cameras off if you like. That'll help us save bandwidth for our presenters and greatly reduce the carbon footprint of our meeting. So we will have 4 presenters this evening with a brief Q&A at the end of the entire presentation, since they're quite related to one another. And some may answer your questions that you may have earlier on. So please type your questions in the chat and we will select questions from there. But if your question is long and or complex, please feel free to ask it in the audio during the Q&A time. So please also feel free to send direct chats to friends that you're seeing in the participant list. So now, before we start our presentation for this evening, please remember to keep your questions in the chat, keep yourself muted, and we'll answer questions at the end of the presentation. And this webinar will extend to about 7 p.m. tonight. Before I formally introduce our speakers tonight, Todd Bartlett would like to give us a little announcement.
Thanks, Dave. For over a year, we've been participating in this ongoing seminar on the geology, hydrology, geomorphology, climatology, forestry, fisheries, agriculture, and mythology of the Clackamas River Basin. This seminar has been a powerful way for us to develop a greater understanding and appreciation of this river basin, its history, its current condition, and its long-term future, as well as our relationship to it and all the beings who live in the basin. Many people deserve our appreciation and thanks, from the original group of people who gathered around the idea and developed it by recruiting and or participating as a presenter, to staff and board members who have provided technical support for these 33 sessions, and to all of you who have participated and been learning through this season. However, I would like to take a few more moments to offer our thanks and gratitude to the one who had the idea, recruited many people, and was a constant presence through these seminars, David Bugney. And if you'd like to add your thanks, please type it into the chat and we can save that chat and we'll get those words to David. When David Bugney proposed this ambitious undertaking, there was excitement and some skepticism that it could be pulled off. As Bill Monroe wrote, questioned at the outset by those of us who doubted it would be possible, Dave simply infected us with his enthusiasm, assembled an impressive team of volunteers, pieced together sponsors and funding, and orchestrated a unique and unprecedented dissection of an entire watershed. Gail Shalom, past president, adds, "I'm grateful for the time and expertise that Dave has donated to make this happen. Those who have attended have gotten a free education in the natural history and natural resources in the Clackamas River Basin. What a journey it's been." This session concludes the original slate of seminars. Our work will continue and the impact will last for many years. Board member Maddie Sheehan wrote, "Dave has created an extremely valuable tool for us to use for years to come as we introduce new CRBC employees, board members, landowners, volunteers to our mission and our work." Cheryl McGinnis, the current CRBC executive director, wrote, "Dave's conviction to restore and protect the Clackamas River watershed is what builds a legacy. As a member of the CRBC board of directors, he extended our staff reach by involving others to the board, partnering agencies and academic institutions to build enthusiasm and the how-to for future stewardship. As the chair of the CRBC and on behalf of the Clackamas River Basin Council and the hundreds of people who have viewed these seminars, David, I would like to say to you, thank you for all your work and the way that you have shaped the future of this organization and generations of beings in this basin to come." And to conclude, I share these words from Bill Monroe, who wrote, "A river now runs through us all, and you are the fountainhead." Thank you, David.
Thank you. I'd say I'm speechless, but I got to introduce some speakers. So this has been great. It's been a lot of fun, and we'll have specials. You know, kind of like how the Star Trek episodes. You know, you had episodes, and then the show got canceled, but then they came back with special movies every so often. That's what we should have. We have a really cool topic. We'll have a journey down the Clackamas Redux or something like that. So with that, let's get on with it. So our first speaker tonight is Jan Lee, and she's a former member of the CRBC, and a current board member of the Clackamas Soil and Water Conservation District, a member of the Water Resources Commission, and the executive director of the Oregon Association of Conservation Districts. Jan has worked in natural resources for 37 years. Our second speaker tonight will be Tom Byler. He's currently director of the Oregon Water Resources Department. And prior to this role, he served 9 years as the executive director of the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. Before OWEB, Tom worked as a natural resources policy advisor for Governors Kulongoski and Kitzhaber. Tom was born and raised in Pendleton. He received his BA from Willamette University and earned his law degree from the University of Oregon School of Law. Our third speaker tonight is, Jim Brick, and he's the implementation coordinator for ODFW and of the Lower Columbia River Salmon and Steelhead Recovery Plan. He received his BS from Iowa State University in Fisheries and Wildlife and spent the past 25 years at ODFW. And our last speaker tonight is Representative Jeff Reardon. For those who looked at our website earlier on, he's pinch hitting for Representative Ken Helm tonight, but he's equally as adept at these issues and has been around them for decades. And Representative Reardon was born and raised in Kelso, Washington. And for 10 years, Representative Reardon served on the David Douglas School District Board of Directors and was first elected to the Oregon Legislature in 2012. He currently co-chairs the Ways and Means Natural Resources Subcommittee and sits on the House Agriculture, Land Use, and Water and House Education Committees. He has chosen not to run for the 6th term that he would be, I'm sure, an easy shoo-in for, and he will leave office at the end of this calendar year. So let's welcome Jan, Tom, Jim, and Representative Reardon as they present about policies providing success in the Clackamas River Basin and a look towards future policies. So take it away, Jan. You're on mute, Jan.
That would help. The question that was asked of me is, what's the success been in regard to watershed councils? The legislation was passed in 1995, that's 27 years ago, and that created the ability to form watershed councils and subsequently creation of a new state agency, the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. So the legislature recognized that voluntarily driven work in local areas would bring new resources to the table to achieve restoration goals. And it has. Councils carry out the vision of the Oregon Salmon Plan and other restoration goals. Projects are partially funded with lottery funds that were voted by the people in both 1998 and 2010 elections to support all of the programs for OWEB. So I believe the goals that were envisioned in 1995 have been more than successfully achieved, leveraging significant funding and resulting in restoration statewide. OWEB has approved 10,100 grants for a total of $684 million as of their last annual report. But I also want to identify the success of our own local watershed council, the Clackamas River Basin Council. As a former member, I know the strength of the work of the volunteer board as well as the dedicated staff. And our Clackamas Conservation District has worked side by side on many projects with the council. Since 1998, when the council began its work, OWEB has funded approximately $7 million for projects the council has carried out. And in addition, other funders have provided another $7 million, bringing to the council a total of around $14 million to do the work. And that is truly success, and the work shows that outcome. Thank you.
Okay, with that, I think, was Tom going to be up next?
I think so. Thank you, Dave, and thanks everyone for the invitation to participate today. I am going to pull up presentation here. Hang on just one second. Can folks see that?
Yes, it looks very good.
All right, thank you. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in the final installment of quite an epic journey that the council has been on, and really a notable one in terms of the effort to educate and reach out to the broader community about the watershed and natural resources issues, and how that interfaces with the community in so many different ways. I'm going to have my remarks focus on the title here is A Brief History of Cooperative Conservation in Oregon. That's really not a brief topic, but I'm going to apply at a very high elevation. But I'm going to expand a little bit on some of Jan's comments, just to give folks a flavor of how we got to where we are today, and kind of some of the key drivers that influenced that journey. So as Jan mentioned, when you look at cooperative conservation in Oregon today, there is a strong funding mechanism through the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. As Jan mentioned, over 10,000 grants have been awarded through the state mechanism, and nearly $700 million in grants probably by now. Those resources, along with other state resources, along with in-kind efforts at the local level and federal dollars, substantial federal dollars, have really fueled a local cooperative, collaborative conservation wave of activity across the state of Oregon that I think is unparalleled in the nation. And it's really spearheaded by local watershed councils like the Clackamas and local soil and water conservation districts, who are the real interface in terms of working with the local community, doing the work to identify problems, to identify solutions to those problems, and then to work to actually make the fix, which often means a lot of engagement with local, state, and federal government employees working on project development and design, fundraising, grant writing, and then project implementation. A lot of work, but important work. So today I want to talk with you about how did we get here? Because I think it's an interesting story. In my mind, we need to look back, turn the clock back to the 1980s. And frankly, you can look back even earlier than that from the standpoint of the 1980s being kind of a critical catalytic period of time. And at that point in the 80s, we were seeing a direct conflict between kind of long-standing practices in our watersheds across the state in terms of development and land management practices, coming into conflict with federal laws that had by and large been enacted by Congress in the late 60s and early 1970s, but were starting to become put into play and having an impact in communities across the West. In Oregon, in particular, it was the northern spotted owl, for those of you who were around during that time, that created a significant crisis in the state of Oregon and a significant conflict in terms of its impacts on communities around the state, timber dependent communities in particular, with the prospect of having, through the Endangered Species Act, significant lands and the practices on those lands changed in order to protect threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. It created a significant social and political turmoil in the state. And so that was a massive shakeup in terms of the status quo for all of us who are interested in natural resources on however you looked at those issues. Things were changing and changing dramatically. At the same time, there was an emerging awareness that existing management practices were not working. And by that, I mean, really from a governmental standpoint, for many, many years and decades, both at the state and federal level, there had been pretty much top-down engagement in terms of these agencies, again, federal and state, carrying out their responsibilities in a manner that was not as sensitive or focused on the local community. It was more along just carrying out their laws and telling those communities what they needed to do. I think the spotted owl crisis and the ESA was a wake-up call, a bit of a smelling salts moment for everyone, and there was an emerging awareness that maybe these agencies needed to start thinking about how they went about their work a little bit differently and being a little more focused and listening better to local communities about the impacts of the programs that they were implementing on those communities. At the same time, during the 1980s, the legislature established the Governor's Watershed Enhancement Board. This was 1987. And it was a pretty modest experiment that kind of played out, was really trying to experiment around the notion of changing practices. And the Governor's Watershed Enhancement Board was a very modest program that provided small education grants around watershed health. It introduced the concept of ridgetop to ridgetop, whole watershed restoration, rather than looking at natural resources issues and environmental issues in a kind of siloed manner. And also had some resources to do some pilot restoration projects. So again, a very small amount of money, but in 1987, I guess the other thing I'd mentioned about GWEB is that it also brought together, through the governor's leadership, a coordination among agencies. There were multiple state agencies and some federal agencies who sat on the GWEB board, and they were starting to talk together in ways that they hadn't in the past. So let's move into the 1990s. as you heard from Jan, in the early 1990s, we started to take more seriously different models of how we work on natural resources issues. And in 1993, the legislature passed essentially a pilot program called the Oregon Watershed Health Program. And that was the trial run at watershed councils. The first pilot councils were established up in Northeast Oregon in the Grand Ronde Basin and in the Rogue Valley. So the Northeast corner and the Southwest corners of the state were the first pilots, if you will, of watershed councils in 1993. There was again, kind of a modest amount of funding to help organize those councils and get them started, and also some funding for restoration projects. And that effort was led by a group called the Strategic Water Management Group. 2 years later, in 1995, the Watershed Health Program was updated significantly. And at that point, the whole concept of watershed councils was refined in legislation and expanded. And GWEB replaced the Strategic Water Management Group as kind of the organizing and funding entity to help move those watershed councils forward. Now, all of this was happening, with the spotted owl issues still firmly on people's minds, but there was also the looming threat of listings under the Federal Endangered Species Act for salmonids throughout the Pacific Northwest. And so there was, I think, a keen interest for policymakers at the legislature to start to think about how can we prepare ourselves for this? How do we start to change our practices and help the environment, knowing that there's a chance that salmonids would be listed throughout most of the state. People were very concerned about it at the time, again, in light of what happened with the spotted owl and all the conflict and controversy and job loss that occurred with that, but also out of concern that the geography that the salmon would touch potentially in terms of listings was even greater than the scale of impact by the spotted owl. So we move on in the timeline. And in 1997, the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds was implemented, spearheaded by Governor Kitzhaber at the time. The legislature was a partner in this. And the whole idea around this effort, a very noble effort indeed, was to try to avoid listings of the salmon under the Federal Endangered Species Act by demonstrating that the state of Oregon was going to take care of business. And by that, I mean that the state of Oregon, through these watershed councils and this local voluntary cooperative conservation effort, were going to do what needed to be done in order to be able to restore habitat necessary to sustain salmon populations and avoid the federal listings. That was, again, a very ambitious effort, but it definitely built a lot of momentum around the notion of an importance of watershed councils and soil and water conservation districts, and local cooperative conservation became really the cornerstone of Oregon's efforts to try to improve conditions for habitat. The salmon plan at the time was funded, as I recall, through general fund dollars, as well as a timber products tax. And the timber products tax ultimately did not pan out. But right along the heels of that became ballot measure 66. Again, Jan referenced this in her remarks. Ballot measure 66 in 1998 was approved by roughly 70% of the Oregon voters. And it was really focused on two things. It carved out 15% of lottery revenues and dedicated it in the Oregon Constitution for two purposes. One, and this is not to be discounted because it was a very high profile part of why I think voters weighed in on Measure 66. One was to replace and put Oregon State Parks on much better footing in terms of their funding resources to be able to maintain parks. At that time, parks were really struggling. Oregon State Parks were in disrepair, and they had funding stream problems that were significant. The other half of that 15%, 7.5%, went to restoration and ecological improvement, and directed that grants be distributed by the state for those purposes of ecological restoration. So very significant ballot Measure 66, and it ended up providing a lot of the fuel to help the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds move forward. And I mentioned GWEB, the Governor's Watershed Enhancement Board. It was modified in 1999 to become the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, and the key agency to distribute that 7.5% of lottery funds for the ecological health and restoration purposes. And again, watershed councils and these local groups became really the foot soldiers in carrying out that work. Also significantly, federal funds through the Pacific Salmon Recovery Fund program came online in the year 2000 and added an annual infusion of federal dollars that also went to help support. It went through OWEB and helped support these types of purposes. So a lot of money got funneled into the Oregon Plan and to watershed councils by virtue of trying to stem the crisis. Now, I have to tell you, you are all probably aware, the listings happened. We did not avert listings, but the value of the work of cooperative conservation has persevered and maintained and is recognized year after year by subsequent governors, by state legislature, by the federal government, that it is really makes a difference to do work this way and through this kind of approach. Through the years, the programs that have supported local watershed councils have evolved. There have been a number of things that I think have been really important to help build the program and sustain it over time. For example, OWEB started to develop a small grant program. These are grants of $10,000 or less that were really kind of startup grants to help entities kind of get their game going, and became a real way to introduce kind of a user-friendly way to introduce folks to this whole model of grant-based, local developed conservation work. Also during this period, there was an effort towards better monitoring, effectiveness monitoring, both at the project level as well as program level. And part of that effectiveness monitoring was really geared towards what I failed to mention when I was describing ballot measure 66. And that is that when that was passed in 1998, that had a time limit to it of 15 years. And so it was effective as of 1999, and it would expire, that constitutional authority would expire in the year 2014 unless it was reauthorized. Well, ballot measure 66 in 2010 was brought forward, which made some minor modifications to measure 66, but essentially brought forward and made permanent the authority to support the grants for ecological restoration purposes, as well as for state parks funding. That was a very big deal. And by virtue of having that permanent funding, OWEB also began to look at longer term investment strategies, knowing that they would have a stable, accessible source of funding over a long period of time. And so different types of investments began to be developed really with that long game mindset that these funds offered, because again, they were dedicated for these purposes under the Oregon Constitution, which means that the legislature could not use them to fund other purposes. So I'm going to wrap up by just making a few observations and maybe underscoring a few things that I think are important. Before I go into my observations, I just want to say that I'm flying at a very high level here. There are a lot of there's a lot that I'm not mentioning that is important in the overall effort that has happened. So my apologies for any big pieces that I'm leaving out, but I hope this gives you a flavor of what has been happening in Oregon. I think it is significant. And here are what I see as kind of the key points. One is local cooperative conservation works. Collaboration and partnership over conflict is a good investment. It results in stronger communities. It avoids social and political conflict at the local level, and can strengthen the social fabric in communities, as well as improving watershed health, which has multiple benefits for the community if done well. And we've seen time and time again with councils and districts around the state that many of these projects that they're working on are really win-win projects that are benefiting many different interests for the people within those watersheds. The other thing coming from this whole approach around collaborative conservation is that the communication that is involved with doing this work well leads to understanding and trust. And again, those are huge assets and can't be underestimated in terms of the value that trust and understanding has in terms of problem solving with issues that can be very personal and difficult and challenging in communities as we're trying to wrestle with how to improve habitat and address species issues or water quality issues. There are a lot of different interests that are at the table, and good communication can lead to good problem solving. The second item here is that state and federal agencies as partners. And I mentioned at the outset that there had been kind of a top-down approach by state and federal agencies. I remember early in my days at OWEB, one of the longtime employees was mentioning to me how things had changed so much in terms of, probably in the 70s and early 80s and maybe throughout the 80s, people didn't talk to each other, and things started to change, and watershed councils were really part of this movement where the people who had an interest, rather than just going to their attorneys and fighting over these issues, started to sit down at the table and talk about the problem together and look for solutions together. And so state and federal agencies, as people who are going to be sitting at the table, to have those conversations is critical. And that is a common practice now. It wasn't 30 years ago, it is today. And I think it's a real improvement. The other thing I would mention is that just the fact that state and federal agencies talk and partner better with each other, let alone with local communities, also is a benefit, I think, that we've seen from the Watershed Council movement. As I mentioned earlier, the ridgetop to ridgetop whole watershed approach is really smart. Watershed councils allow us to do that. They're not bound by artificial jurisdictional boundaries that cut through and across the landscape in odd ways. It allows for more comprehensive solutions to be developed to restore ecological function. And lastly, and certainly not leastly, and I think this is actually the key ingredient, is the dedicated long-term funding that ballot measure 66 and ballot measure 76 have provided. Without that, I fear that despite the good legislation around watershed councils and all of the good efforts of folks would have been for naught, because we wouldn't have had the resources and capacity to be able to carry out as much as we have in Oregon. So not to be underestimated here is just the value of the long-term funding. So with that, I want to thank everyone, and I will pull out of my presentation and look forward to question time when the other speakers are done.
Thanks, Tom. That was marvelous. So I think our next speaker coming up is Jim Brick. Jim, are you ready for us?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
That was a great presentation we just saw. But I wanted to also thank you guys and everybody for giving me the opportunity to come and speak on this last series of the journey down the Clackamas. Policy can be dry, but we hope to liven it up a little bit and explain to you why it's important. And I hope you take a couple of messages away when I'm finished with my presentation. The first being why I and my state agency, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, are excited to be part of the Clackamas Partnership. I know this is the Clackamas River Basin Council, but they are leading the Clackamas Partnership, and I'm very excited to be part of that partnership. And the second piece of information that I hope you take home today is not only having an understanding of what's been done so far, but having a better understanding of the breadth and the amount of work that still needs to be done to get us to where we think we need to be. And so with that, I will start the presentation. Can you see that? Oh,
Not yet.
not yet. Hold on. I gotta window.
Something's coming up. You got.
I don't think that's what you want to see. All right, try it one more time. Stop sharing that. Sorry about the delay.
No problem.
Okay, can you see that one?
Not yet.
That's open.
If you have trouble, Jim, Cheryl, did Jim email you his presentation and you could run it and he could narrate?
I have it and I can share my screen now if you'd like me to, Jim.
Yes, because I'm not seeing it pop up on my window, even though it's open now. Sorry about that.
No problem. That's why we got backups.
Here you go.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. I appreciate that.
You bet.
So I've got a couple of slides here that is going to be a somewhat of a repeat of what we heard previously, but it's going to take a little bit of slant. And so this is a story basically about endangered species, and you heard that in previous presentations. And I'm not going to go through every decade and go through, but this is key to the discussion because this story really is about endangered species. You heard about starting it off with the spotted owl and concerns and moving up into the list of the salmonids. But there are two key points that I wanted to point out under the Endangered Species Act. And so this is a law that's basically about conserving ecosystems necessary for the survival of threatened endangered species that are in the United States. And the second key point that I want to point out is this law allows individuals and organizations to petition to have a species listed as threatened or endangered. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now we're going to jump up, and there's a date in there on the Native Fish Conservation Policy of 2002 that's kind of important. But jumping to the next piece of policy that I'm going to touch on is this is the policy. You heard that state agencies were learning to deal with things and the demand to to manage basically fish under this policy in a manner that's consistent with endangered species. But a couple of things about this native fish conservation policy: it directed the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife on how to manage fish, and those on all native fish species. And it covered the entire state, and it went from Southeast Oregon to Northwest Oregon. It was very broad. But there are two key pieces of information that I wanted to present to you regarding the native fish conservation policy. And so in the policy, there were three areas of emphasis. And one of the important ones is that we were directed to be proactive to restore and maintain native fish at levels that provide, and this is the important part, at ecological and societal benefits. And we'll touch base on that as I progress through these slides. And the second piece that is important is that it directs ODFW to manage fish basically at with conservation plans, which are done at what's called the evolutionary significant unit, which is a designation by National Marine Fisheries Service, but it's much smaller than statewide. And in the Clackamas, we're in the Lower Columbia River evolutionary significant unit. Next slide, please. Next slide.
Got it up there, Jim. It's
Okay, I'm sorry. All right, thank you. All right, so before I dive off into managing under the conservation plans, I wanted to also touch on a couple of key funding issues and tie those to the Endangered Species Act. So around the late 1990s, there was a petition to list Oregon coastal coho, and that really spurred a lot of effort. You know, GWEB and OWEB were already evolving, but this was a key moment in time when they were starting to press on listing fish. And you heard that the geographic scope was a large concern. And so the Oregon legislature, the governor, NOAA, and a bunch of folks came together and developed what was called the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds. And a key to this, and what we just heard a minute ago, the mission of the Oregon plan was to recover fish and get them to an abundance level that is sustainable in a manner that provides substantial ecological, cultural, and economic benefits. And we heard that under the native fish conservation policy, and we're hearing it again right here. And so this was an effort to prevent the delisting or to prevent the listing of Oregon coastal coho. And one of the things that came with this was an agreement with NOAA and the state of Oregon to create a large pot of money that was actually intended for coastal salmonid restoration. But that was a key pot, another key pot of money that was driving the restoration community at that time. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, as we already heard, the effort to prevent the listing of Oregon coastal coho was not successful. And shortly after that, we started seeing listings of salmonids from Washington down to California. And what's key here is that Oregon Coastal Restoration Initiative actually morphed into what's called the Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery Fund. And that happened back in 2000. And that was an effort to fuel restoration and improve conditions for salmon all up and down the coast. And there's a couple key pieces here. Is in a 20-year period, they put $1.4 billion into this fund, and it leveraged almost another $2 billion. And we'll hear in a little bit on a couple of slides down the road how important this Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery Fund is. It still exists today, and it's very key. Next slide, please. And so now so what the Native Fish Conservation Policy did is it directed ODFW to manage fish at the ESU level. And so back in 2010, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife completed the Lower Columbia River Conservation and Recovery Plan. And I am an implementation coordinator for that recovery plan. And so we're going to dive into this a little bit. But the recovery plan, again, this is, it's smaller in scale in terms of the area it covers, from basically Hood River to Astoria, including the Clackamas. But what it did is it looked at what the status of the fish were, what the threats were caught, and what threats were manifesting into the mortality rates on our listed fish populations. And so they looked at 6 general threats, and you can see on the left the 6 general threats, but we're really here to talk about the tributary. And so there is a number of strategies and actions to overcome those threats and reduce those mortality rates on our listed fish populations, particularly in the Clackamas. Another key element that I want to convey to you is that there are really 2 goals in this conservation and recovery plan. There is the delisting goal, which gets us under that federal burden or over that federal burden. But there's also what's called a broad sense recovery goal. And that is to get fish to an abundance level that will provide significant ecological, cultural, and economical benefits. And so that's the 3rd time we've heard that phrase. And so the ultimate goal is to get fish to a broad sense goal of having abundant fish on the landscape to meet all Oregonians' needs. Next slide, please. And so now we're going to dive a little bit more into detail on the recovery plan. Down at the very bottom of this slide is back in 2010, you can see the current status of fish populations in the Clackamas Basin. You see coho was a moderate risk of extinction and on down for the other species that are found in the Clackamas. Well, what the recovery plan did is they looked at a delisting scenario, and it goes into how NOAA defines a delisting scenario for the ESU, but it allows some flexibility to leave some at low risk, some at moderate risk, and some at high risk, as long as you look at all the populations and it gets to a moderate low. And so the delisting scenario allows us to have populations at higher risk and some at low risk. And so what they did for the tributary habitat piece is they developed overarching strategies, and I circled those. And the important part about the tributary habitat strategies, it says protect the best, and then identify, prioritize, and restore degraded habitat. And so now we're diving into what we're trying to accomplish in the Clackamas Basin, is to prioritize and restore, identify, prioritize, and restore a habitat in the Clackamas Basin itself to make improvements for these fish species you see below. Next slide, please. Up one, please. That one right there, yeah. And so this is another dive into it. And so this is Clackamas winter steelhead. And so this is part of the scenario analysis that was conducted under the recovery plan. And I'm not going to go into all these numbers, but there's a couple of important pieces here, and I circled where we should be focusing on. And so if you look at the row that says current status, and this is for steelhead, you can see that steelhead in the Clackamas, well, it's actually the Clackamas population that covers all of the tributaries in the Willamette up to Willamette Falls, including like Johnson Creek and Columbia Slough and some of the other tributaries. But you can see that under their current modeling, it shows that Clackamas winter steelhead are suffering almost a 65% mortality rate from tributary associated with tributary habitat. And so on the blue row below that, you'll see the low extinction risk, and that's where the planning team and the recovery plan says we need to go to create a delisting scenario. So what that means is we've got to take our existing mortality rate from 65% and get it down to 23%. And if you toggle over to the abundance column, you'll see if we were to get to there, we would about triple our population on average. That's a 100-year average, but instead of having 3,800 fish return on average, it would be closer to 10,000. Thank you, Cheryl. The other important piece on this line is the maximum feasible all. And that's what the planning team thought was the best they could really do in the basin for winter steelhead. It's not like that for every species. But they said, given the infrastructure and where these guys are spawning, we don't think we can really make the level of improvements needed to get to a delisting scenario. And so they said, under the maximum feasible all, we think we can get to 40, we could reduce the mortality rate from 65 to 47%. Our goal is still to get it down to 23%, but the 47% is where they thought we would land on. The best we could do. Next slide, please. And so what you see here is a table, and this table is built off of a table that you found in the recovery plan. And in the recovery plan, they actually looked at the broad sense scenario for creating restoration metrics that we need to try to accomplish to reduce that mortality rate of the various fish species in the basin. What I did, and when you look at that, you almost can get sticker shock on the amount of work that needs to be done to reduce those mortality rates. And so what I did is I went in and I plugged in so in the broad sense recovery goal, we had to improve mortality from 65% down to 23%. That's about what, 40% or more. Under the maximum feasible all, it was improving it by about 17%. So I went in and I plugged that 17% improvement. And what they did is they looked at habitat and they looked at the existing conditions. They said, if we move the poor and moderate habitat into moderate and good habitat through restoration and move it closer to restoration condition or to reference conditions, we would improve our mortality. It's a lot more complicated than that, but that's kind of basically in a nutshell. But I use the maximum feasible all as kind of more of a first step so that the watershed councils are not hit with a sticker shock on how much is really needed just to reduce that mortality rate to a delisting scenario. So I would consider this step one of step three of restoration needs in the Clackamas Basin. And you can see it's quite extensive yet with 62 miles of large wood and 65 miles of side channel. And these were requested, it's a voluntary plan, but these were requested to be done over a 15-year period between 2010 and 2025. Next slide, please. And so what you see here on the left is the actual accomplishments that was been done in the Clackamas Basin, starting back when the plan was approved in 2010. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the percentage of the goal based upon that maximum feasible all goal that I showed in the last slide. The Clackamas Basin, or in the Clackamas population, actually, they've achieved the restoration goals for off-channel habitat and riparian restoration. But if you look at the in-stream habitat and side channel, those are really lacking. And those are the primary limiting factors affecting tributary habitat and all populations of fish that are in the Clackamas. So you can see that for side channel, we've got about 5.5% basically, or 3.5 miles of side channel done over about an 11-year period. And so you can see we're kind of behind that. Next slide, please. And so knowing that, I kind of approached Cheryl back in, I don't know, 16 or 17 and started talking about this OWEB potential called a focus investment program, where they were looking at long-term investment strategies that we heard before. And the first step in doing that is, well, to form a partnership amongst a group of folks and write an action plan that will kind of guide the partnership going forward in the future. An important part of this action plan that was developed by the partnership is that the partners kind of agreed to try to match their restoration activities to meet the recovery plan for the habitat needs for listed salmon and steelhead that are actually in the Clackamas Basin. And so we're trying to achieve those goals, at least accelerate the pace of what we're going on now to treat those primary limiting factors. Next slide. And so after we completed our capacity or our strategic action plan, we went back to OWEB and applied for an actual implementation grant, and we received $9 million. That's very significant. And one of the pieces that's very important in that is instead of going to OWEB on a yearly basis in the open solicitation process, OWEB gave us $9 million to spend over 6 years, and we don't have to compete with projects in the McKinsey and the Santiam and all the way up through the Sandy Basin. We have this money and we can determine how to spend it ourselves. And our strategic action plan is our guidance on where we're going to put projects out on the ground and how we're going to do it. And so earlier I talked about the Pacific Coast Salmon Recovery Fund. We are almost 100% funded through this fund. We do have lottery dollars, but we're almost completely funded through this because it's aquatic habitat for listed fish species. Next slide. And so this kind of takes us almost to on the ground what we're doing right now. We started in 2019 where we were awarded funding, but by the time we got the funds in the in-water work period, we really didn't get started until 2020. And then we were hit by COVID, and that really slowed us down. And so we would have liked to be a little bit further ahead than we actually are, but this is a list of projects that we've done or scheduled to do over the next 2 years. The Oregon Focus Investment Program will last longer for our Clackamas partnership than these years here. But what you can see here is we have focused on side channels of the Clackamas River. And if you've ever seen you probably have never seen the landslide tow proposal, but that is a project where we're looking at restoring 1.5 miles of side channel. And if you look at these 8 projects here, it's about 5 miles of side channel, and 5 to 6 miles. And we're going to accomplish that in about 4 years compared to completing 3 miles in the last 11 years. We're going to hopefully, and we've already done this, take that $9 million and use it as seed money. And we've gone to Metro, we've gone to PGE, and we're going to others that are offering money under the Federal Infrastructure and Jobs Act to expand on that. But if we could triple what we have now in the next 5 years before those goals are, we would advance our goals almost to that first step of maximum feasible, which would allow us to springboard hopefully in the future into the delisting goals. And so this is very significant here. And the others, let's go to the next slide, please. And so this is the final slide. These are 2 projects that were completed. The Eagle Creek project was completed in 2020, and Kingfisher was completed in 2021. And the reason we have focused on the side channels of the Clackamas River is a couple fold. Number one, in previous presentations, you probably heard from Pacific General Electric on how the hydroelectric project is now passing juvenile fish at 97% survival, which is very significant. So we have more fish coming down and wanting to rear in side channels of the Clackamas. And by treating side channels on the Clackamas River, we're actually benefiting coho, steelhead, spring chinook, fall chinook, lamprey. They're all going to be using these type of habitats. And one of the things I wanted you all to take away from this conversation was the breadth of what we need yet to do. But looking at these structures, we're teeing into the Clackamas River itself, and you can see the magnitude of structures that we need to build to basically partition water out of the Clackamas and water up side channels. These pictures are not the complete project. They're I think Kingfisher is about 2,000 feet long, and it has large wood throughout it. But our monitoring to date has been showing, which is limited because we do 1 year pre and 1 year post, and we hope to change that to do more in the future. But our monitoring is showing us when we meet some of our objectives for large woody debris loading, we're actually showing physical improvement in habitat conditions. And so these type of projects are not cheap. They're expensive because you have to do a lot in order to maintain these projects into the future. They have to be built big. And so with that, I just wanted to thank the Clackamas Partnership. I want to thank everybody here. This has been a wonderful opportunity to explain what we're doing and why we need to continue the great work we're doing right now.
Thanks, Jim. That was an awesome overview. And I look forward now to listening to Representative Reardon wrap us up for the evening as well as the whole session. So Representative Reardon, take it away, please.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much. This is where I really wish we were in person, because I just hate that I can't see people. I have no idea how old you are. You know, are you engaged? Are you off getting your evening drinks and snacks, or what's going on out here? So it makes it really kind of difficult to talk to you. And but let me give you just a little bit of background. So I'm a state District 48, which is partly Multnomah, partly Clackamas County. I'm here substituting for Representative Ken Helm. Now, if you're really fortunate, he would actually be here because he has a background. He has law practices around land and water issues. I'm more of a typical legislator. And by that, I'm going to be talking a little bit about stuff we've done in Salem. But what I'd like you to understand and kind of take away from this is that a lot of your legislators are not trained in law for the stuff that they're dealing with. So in my case here, I just found water and recognized the crisis situation that we're in a few years ago and got personally engaged. And that's one of the cool things about being in this position is I can do that and I can talk to people. And a legislator has the challenges, the privilege, I guess, of being able to bring people together that know about the subject matter. So I would encourage anybody that's here tonight is, keep up with this work, because the legislators depend on you. We cannot be experts in everything that comes before us. Think about all the issues, whether it be, taxes, homelessness, healthcare, whatever. We need people like you that are really well informed that can come forward, and when we have our hearings, when we have our meetings in a building, letters that you write, all of those things are really a necessary part of the process. So anyway, so I do have some comments, largely taken from what Rep. Helm would have said if he was here today, and interject a few of my own experiences and thoughts as well. But this has really been fascinating. Hearing Director Byler talk about some of the history of the legislation. I didn't get involved until about 2012. And just to see all of the things that preceded that and all the work that's been done, it's humbling. But I think there's been a renewed interest, I think for probably a few reasons. And when I talk water this evening, I'm talking about water in not just the Clackamas River, not the water that we see, but the water in all the forms that it's used and where it occurs. So, but I think, obviously climate change and a drought have really forced changes in management for water. And until about 1980, prior allocation was sufficient. It to allocate water to all uses. Back in the day, and I'm old enough to say this, I think people really thought that water and the forest were just infinite resources. Just use all you want. And then we found out with greater economic change for both surface and groundwater, that the economic demand, I should say, starting probably in the 1990s, then also the listing, as Mr. Brick talked about in detail about the salmonoid and the ESA listings, that put the pressure on all of Oregon, especially Eastern Oregon. And of course, the hottest decade on record since starting, last 10 years that we've had heat waves. And we're seeing, in all likelihood, that our snow cap is going to be disappear by 2040. So it's just kind of horrifying to me how rapidly all of this is happening. So legislature has done some work along the way. They did have a water committee in the mid 2000s. They made a little progress. Tom talked about some of those things. And then they kind of went to sleep for a decade. And honestly, when I got there in 2012, the first integrated water resources strategy manual was published, but my impression was nobody knew it. And I apologize to anybody that worked on it for saying that, but it just, nobody was talking water. And yet we were learning that our current system just really wasn't up to snuff and properly allocating the water. There was a pilot project started in 2015. And in Harney County, most of you may be aware of that, maybe not. My chief of staff, Ryan, who's I think is still on here this evening, we traveled down to Harney County, and in summer, I think it was 2018, we met with then Commissioner Mark Owens, who is now state representative, and had a barbecue with the locals, talked about some of the water. We had people that were drilling wells and so forth, and they were talking about their challenges. But if you don't know about Harney County, they are the kind of like the they're met by the economic issues because there wasn't over allocation of water. They're trying to figure out, what do you do when you have to, you don't have as much water as you thought. There's not as much water in the account as you thought. How does that impact this economically, this farming community? What do they do? So they've been doing place-based planning. I was able to sit in on the community meetings down there and kind of hear firsthand from that, and really became convinced that this was a great method. And I'll tell a short story about one real simple reason why I think that place-based planning works. And here we are early in the morning, had some people there, teenagers. Then there was a couple that were in their mid to late 60s. And they were talking about their farm and the impact of not having enough water. And I'm thinking, okay, here we go. They're going to start talking about, what do we do to preserve my water so I can keep my farm going for, I got a retirement to worry about. They didn't. They were talking about, how do we have enough water? How do we keep our local economy going for decades, for generations to come? And I thought that was so powerful. And I think that happened because they had a lot of breakfast meetings together. They were talking about the same issues. Eventually, they were looking at the same data. They wanted more data, but they were looking at the same facts, the same issues, and they got to know each other. So I just think it's really a powerful thing. Anyway, so I came back, and I was really excited about this. I advocated for the reestablishment of a water committee. Apparently, others were also interested, and I became vice chair. Rep. Helm was chair, and by then, Commissioner Owens became Representative Owens. And so the three of us have really bonded and really collaborated on talking about different water issues. Probably the most striking thing is the need for more data, whether it be stream data or groundwater data. And so been a lot of funding on that, and so a lot more that needs to be done. So need to work on the data, but at the same time, cities are dealing with clean water permits, source supply and stormwater. There's a lot of cities that have drinking water. Utilities are facing challenges as their systems are heading toward the end of life. I think about a hearing we had for the city of Banks, just as one example. Small community, West Washington County, and is sort of landlocked, but they want to grow. There's a lot of industries that want to join their area, and they cannot do it. and their water systems or sewage systems are just outdated, and they need, tons of money. So that's just one example of the sort of work, and I think that's could be found across the state. The systems are just wearing out, and just greater and greater demand. So I want to talk briefly about, we did have a historic session in 2021. As if you were listening to the earlier folks, you just heard money, money, money kept coming up quite frequently. That seemed to be a common theme, and what you can do with that. Mr. Rick's talking about the amount of work that's done on those streams. That is so exciting to hear that, because that's pretty neat. So in 21, I honestly think that Rep. Helm and Owens and I just kind of got together, made up our minds that we wanted to get a comprehensive water package that would look at needs across the state to the greatest extent possible. We worked with Director Byler, who was just, his knowledge and his commitment is so great. But also at the time, we had the OEB director with Maida Lofsgarden, and I'm sure many of you know Maida. And 5 of us really worked together, and a few other people as well, that kind of just came up with this broad strategy. And so we ended up pulling together $538 million, which is just has never been done before in the state of Oregon. So if you'll bear with me, let me just give you a quick rundown. Maybe you know this, but I can't read your faces. So, but $275 million for improvements to drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure. $135.7 million for public works funds and financial assistance programs to repair and replace water infrastructure. $46.5 million for regional and basin specific projects. Almost $40 million to increase Oregon's water supply, and $11.2 million to modernize the data collection and technology used to monitor our water supplies. $17.7 million for water quality improvements. $6.5 million to make Oregon's water infrastructure safer and more resilient. I don't know if you're aware, but we have a lot of dam safety issues, and we need a lot more information about those. And the thing I'm probably most excited, it seems like a smallest investment, is $5 million to support Oregon's 100-year water vision and equitable water access and state, local, and regional water planning. So that's an ongoing work. And so what we're trying to do now, based on taking the $5 million, is figure out a better system for managing all water systems in the state. And right now, I mean, as you know, if you've seen one basin, you've seen one basin, and everything is different across the state. So, and I also talked a little bit earlier about place-based planning. How do we take the local expertise in individual basins and allow them to interact in a productive way with the state? What should the state be doing to help them with their plans? And then I think the next step is, how do we roll that up into a comprehensive budget and do it in a way that's fair and equitable? And I think just as important, and maybe more important, is how do we get people involved in those conversations that haven't been involved? And we've had a lot of our people of color, a lot of indigenous peoples that have not been fully represented in these water conversations. And so we're trying to address that. I had a small bill that just allowed funding so that people that haven't been engaged can get a few bucks to help them get to the meetings, and maybe they need childcare, whatever they need. So I'm not sure how that funding is working, but just trying to have a broader conversation, yet specific to basins and in a fair and equitable way. So The frustrating thing from my standpoint, we're right in the middle of it. We've only had a very short time to do this big thing. So I'm one of the three legislators that's sort of guiding the process, but we don't want it to be a top-down process. We don't want the legislators dictating what's going to happen. So we're trying to be one step removed from the 30 or so experts that are sitting around this table. One of these experts is Director Byler, and correct me if I say this incorrectly, but I think that the WRD is there as technical resource and to help guide the conversation along. But basically, we've got people from many industries and many communities, about roughly 30 or so, that are in these monthly conversations and trying to come up with a way to do a better management. We'll see what happens. Like I said, I'm used to being at the table. I'm used to having all the information, and so not to have that is just like, oh, please let me join. So I've tried to give you an overview of some of the stuff that's gone on. So we're trying to address water. The one thing I want to close with is that despite what you may hear in other topics, this water is recognized as a bipartisan issue, and I'm so thankful for that. And Rep. Owens and Helm and I refer to each other as the three amigos. I think the word is kind of spread that we work well together, and we're not going to be making decisions independently. We don't want people playing one side against the other. So anyway, I hope this gives you some idea of the role of a legislator. We're not necessarily the experts on everything. We can convene people. We rely on folks like yourselves to help us make the right policies and make the right investments to lead the way for all of Oregon. So I'll end it right there.
Thank you very much, Representative Reardon. Wonderful job to all our speakers. So now we open it up for a question and answer session. So if the question is fairly easy to type in, please feel free to type it in the chat box, and Todd will go through them and ask the questions. If it's more complex, just raise your hand and Todd will call on you, and you can go ahead and ask your question.
This is an outstanding panel tonight because we don't have any questions. They answered them all. Oh, Mike, go ahead. Mike Fernandez.
Okay, this is for Jim. Was there any setback on restrictions and problems with the last administration? And has that been ratified? Am I mute? Is that it?
Are you sure you're directing the question to the right person? I work for the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I don't deal with the legislative issues that much.
Well, I believe there were like program was eliminated or endangered species were removed from listings, and I don't know if that affected Oregon and if that was able to be reinstated. I think.
Well, to my knowledge, there's only been one fish species that's been delisted in Oregon, and it was not a salmonid. It was like a borax lake chub, or down in Southeast Oregon. So there's been no delisting of fish under the ESA at this point in time.
Okay.
Maybe if I could weigh in a little bit on that, just to provide maybe a different perspective on Mike's question. I think, Mike, your question is with the change in administration at the federal level, what happened in the last administration? And I don't have specifics, but I will say that it matters who's in charge, and it can affect stream flows of funding, and it can affect priorities in terms of programs and agencies. And so, I do think that, in generally speaking, the partnerships and the work that had been underway for a long time around watershed restoration and watershed health continued, even under the past federal administration. And I think it's a testament to the excellent work that's been done prior to that to institutionalize a lot of these efforts, so that they were very strong and stable, even under leadership that was not as committed to those types of goals.
Okay, thank you both.
Any other questions, Todd?
I'm not seeing any come up on the chat quite yet. So
Okay. Well, while you're waiting, I'll just kind of close out here. So our thanks to Jan, Tom, Jim, and Representative Reardon for tonight's encouraging and educational program. It was a great wrap up, I think. We also thank again our gold sponsors, the Oregon Beverage Recycling Cooperative and Clackamas Water Environment Services, and our bronze sponsors, the Clackamas River Water Providers, Metro Port Blakely, and the Geological Society of the Oregon Country, and everyone else who contributed to help keep this conference free for everybody over the past 15 months or so. So again, thank you for joining us tonight. And over the past 15 months, it's been a truly wonderful experience. So please stay tuned for special presentations, like I mentioned, perhaps in the future after we take a little R&R from this and think of something new and exciting. But Todd, did any other questions come up?
yeah, so there's a question for, somebody just said, never mind. So I guess that takes care of it. No other questions at this point. I will post in the chat the link to our YouTube channel so that you can go back and listen to previous sessions, or if you want to watch this one again, you're free to do that. So they're all there, and enjoy those at your leisure.
Thank you, everybody. It's just been a wonderful journey. So you all take it easy, and hopefully we'll catch you in the future.
Thank you again, David Bugney, for your work on this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is wonderful.
Thank you to our presenters, and thank you for public service. Helps in our state. Thank you so very much, and emulates in other states that wish they could do the same.
Mm-hmm.
And thanks to all the members of CRBC on the board who put so much work into this, and the staff.
Thanks, Jan.
Bye-bye.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Good night.